Welcome to the Spring 2016 gathering of the Vancouver Institute for Social Research, our critical theory free school on unceded Coast Salish territory. Just a few words about Visor. We have no academic or institutional affiliations and no operating budget whatsoever. Everything that takes place here does so on a volunteer basis because it's imperative to us that we create an inclusive para-academic environment in which no money changes hands, and attendees feel comfortable speaking freely about things like hegemonic institutions, corporations, and political parties, or any other place the lecture may take you. So I just wanted to pause and thank the folks at the Ord Gallery, John Kincaid and Jonah in particular, for allowing us to hold this event here free of charge. And to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend. As many of you know, previous Visor terms have been organized around themes such as violence, biopolitics, and sovereignty. This term's organizing theme is fantasy, ideology, media. Three somewhat interchangeable terms that we felt were especially timely at this particular moment. So as always, we've approached a diverse array of scholars, many of whom are professors at post-secondary institutions, some of whom are not, and asked them to craft lectures based on one or several of these terms, fantasy, ideology, media. Next week, local poet and visual artist Donato Mancini will be discussing the ideology of the literary canon. The following week, UBC's Alessandra Santos will be discussing contemporary currents in new media studies. The week after that, SFU Communications, Zoe Druitt will be discussing the video art of Natalie Bookchin, and so on and so forth, every Monday night at 7 p.m. for the next 2 months. Last of all, I just wanted to underscore that this is an inclusive, accessible event, which means that people behaving in an overtly racist, sexist, homophobic, or otherwise hostile and toxic fashion will be asked to leave by me. Our inaugural Visor lecture is being given by Clint Burnham. Clint is an SFU English literature professor and poet who has written prolifically on subject matter ranging from the Vancouver poetry scene to Lacanian psychoanalysis, to the narcissism of selfie culture, to the Marxist criticism of Fredric Jameson. On a personal note, Clint graciously allowed me to sit in on his psychoanalysis and Marxism seminar in the summer of 2009. And it was one of the most rewarding critical theory seminar experiences I have had to date. So, of course, he was one of the first people we thought of when Anne and I first started organizing this series. And to our delight, he did not hesitate to say yes. Just before we welcome Clint, I just wanted to get a few housekeeping issues out of the way. Just so you know, the bathroom is in the back. Feel free to get up and go at any time if you have to. And there's a water pitcher back there too. So if you've got a thermos or something, help yourself to water. And please turn your ringers and buzzers on your phones off so that Clint's talk is undisrupted. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Clint Burnham.
Excuse me. Yeah. Such a crown what?
Yeah.
Jack?
Yeah.
How much money?
72,000 last month.
You show me a pay stub for $72,000, I'm gonna quit my job right now and I work for you. Hey, listen, I quit. Yeah, I'm going to start.
My name is Jordan Belfort. At the tender age of 22, I headed to the only place that could fit my high-minded ambitions.
The name of the game. Move the money from your client's pocket into your pocket.
But if you can make your clients money at the same time, it's advantageous to everyone, correct?
No.
I started my own firm out of an abandoned auto body shop. We will be targeting the wealthiest 1% of Americans.
I love three things. I love my country, I love Jesus Christ, and I love making people rich. Hello?
But I needed to mold them in my own image. With this script, I'm going to teach each and every one of you to be the best. This is the greatest company in the world! I was becoming a legend.
Aren't you married?
Yeah, but married people can't have friends.
I'm not gonna be friends.
I was making so much money, I didn't know what to do with it.
$26,000 for one dinner!
Dad, we're not poor anymore.
Tell them about the size.
What are
these size? They cure cancer? Besides, they cure cancer, that's the problem. They were there, that's why they were expensive. 22 million!
The real question is this: was all this legal? Absolutely not.
You up from the hill.
Show your whole inner circle. This is bad. It's okay. Rub my temple. You're alright. This right here is the land of opportunity.
You just tried to bribe a federal officer.
This is America.
This is my house!
Good for you, little man.
Leave it, little man. The show goes on! I'm gonna need to send in the National Guard to keep me out, because I ain't going nowhere!
It don't work for you, man.
Yeah, my money takes me goose. Technically, it works for me.
That's actually the wrong trailer. It's getting worse than digging around. So the trailer that I thought I sent a link to actually is the soundtrack is Kanye West Black Skinhead, which was released in June of 2013. Am I close enough to the mic? Yeah. Which was released in June of 2013. But just with the release of Kanye's album, which is about to drop, my whole lecture is, but part of the premise was that actually Kanye West's song never appears in the film. So it just sort of sent a marketing move on the part of Scorsese's publicity team, and there's an argument I'll get to around that, but now you know what the film is about if you're not already. So Fredric Jameson and The Wolf of Wall Street. When I would tell people when I started working on this book a couple of years ago, it seemed to be, or the argument was that the book writes itself, like what could be more appropriate than to bring Marxism and the film of Wall Street together. Isn't this self-evident? Do you need anything more than that one-liner? It's sort of, it seems a bit obvious. But to quote from somebody who I don't quote from in the book because there's a whole firewall of not talking too much about psychoanalysis, and we'll get to that. As Jacques Lacan would say, les non-dupes, which is that the unfooled, or the people who think they're not fooled, are the ones who are making the mistake. Or I could also think of a line in an Agatha Christie novel where Poirot and Hastings go to a play about a detective, and Poirot is sort of like fidgeting all the way through the play, and afterwards he explodes in rage at Hastings and lists all the inaccuracies of the play and how all the mistakes that were made in it. And of course, the mistake that Poirot makes there is not able to indulge in the entertainment of the play. He sort of gets too caught up on the empirical or on realism in a certain kind of way. And that would be the Marxist kind of mistake to think that, well, this is not an accurate depiction of late capitalism, of finance capitalism, and therefore it's just some kind of a capitalist entertainment. So that's the question I want to begin with first of all, then, or ask this question: is the film a parody of Wall Street, some kind of Occupy Wall Street avant la lettre, as it were, or is it just another pop cultural artifact, right with misogyny, ableism, and white privilege? My argument actually is that what the film does
course, this is asked the wrong question because what the film does is it helps us to think about what finance, capital, and money are today. So I want to begin then with two related arguments. First, around the importance of Fredric Jameson and what is loosely called symptomatic criticism, which is a term applied to cultural criticism emerging since around the 1960s, especially at the Althusserien moment, or the sort of French theory moment of bringing together structuralist readings of Marx and of Freud, but certainly given new life with Jameson's 1981 book, The Political Unconscious, which argued for the non-dit, en pensée, that is to say, the importance of a Freudian unconscious as a methodological tool for a Marxist or materialist cultural critique, looking for contradictions which are formal and not just at the level of content, to be arguing that those kind of contradictions are to be found in cultural texts, which contradictions then are related to the social and not just to the individual. So the political unconscious is not simply an individual's unconscious and repressed desires or anxieties to be found in the bourgeois monad, but are more social in some kind of way. And the important thing that Jameson argued at that point in 1981 was for the relevance of these mechanisms of distortion and exclusion, or what he also called strategies of containment. That those mechanisms are the unconscious, those structures are the unconscious. So the unconscious is not, even whether at an individual or a social level, it's not that we don't want to, it's something we don't want to acknowledge, but it's how we don't want to acknowledge. It's the form of that lack of acknowledgement, not the putative content. For example, we saw one scene in the clip a minute ago where they're dangling this guy over the edge of a apartment balcony. It's DiCaprio's butler, his gay butler, who at one point they came home and found him having an orgy with a bunch of his friends, and then they're worried that he stole some money. So in a first level reading, you might say this is an indication of the homophobia of the film itself, that has to eject from the film's narrative this gay butler. But really, partly my argument is that butler is actually indicative or symptomatic of the homosexuality we found all the way through the film itself. In the very scene, if anyone has seen the film itself, in the very scene where he's in the very scene where they're confronting the butler, he mentions that one of DiCaprio's friends, played by Jonah Hill, they saw him at a gay club, at a lollipop, I think it's called. Right? I know it's called that. And so the argument then is that actually there already is a sort of homosexual or gay content in the film itself, and therefore the film, in a way, is ejecting itself. So these mechanisms of distortion, of exclusion, but also strategies of containment. Now the reason I begin with this argument around the symptomatic is because of the recent hegemony in film as well as literary criticism of a post-theory moment or an anti-theory moment. In film studies, there's a 1996 book edited by David Bordwell and Noel Carroll called Post-Theory, as well as what is in literary studies is called surface reading. And so in these tendencies, these anti-theoretical tendencies, there's a sort of disparagement of the symptomatic for its affects, paranoia, for its questions of whether post 9/11 isn't it very obvious how power works. And indeed, in a 2009 issue of Representations, engaging precisely with these issues and indeed taking on Jameson's legacy, for example, Marcus and Best in their introduction make a reference to Abu Ghraib or to the Bush on the aircraft carrier after the invasion and the winning the invasion, as it were, of Iraq in 2003, and say, well, why do we need this complicated theory? Isn't it very obvious what exactly is going on? And yet, those are very precise the moments when what seems to be at the surface that I argue that, and I think Jameson would argue as well, that we need to have this sort of way of thinking that still looks below the surface itself. So now I'd like to turn to some of how Jameson talks about film in particular. I begin in the text that this is drawn from with two key essays. And one is Fredric Jameson writing about an essay on reification in Utopia. And here he argues for the importance of mass culture in general, and he does two things. First of all, he makes the argument that there are these two dialectical ways in which people will talk about mass culture. One is to sort of breathlessly praise it. Mass culture is how we understand what the mass is, what is popular. This tells us what is actually happening in the political world today or in the social. On the other hand, owing more to the Frankfurt School, there's a sort of a total negation of the popular. It's seen as being the popular is seen as being only a commodified form of cultural production. So Jameson then argues, or extends this argument by looking at two texts, or two films, Jaws and The Godfather. This essay was first written, published in 1979, so we're dealing with 1970s films. And he reads Jaws then in terms of how the three main characters allegorize post-World War II U.S. history. So if you remember, I was talking with Chris Kapsek the other day. He teaches film at SFU, and he's bemoaning the fact that when he shows Jaws, that students are busy texting away in the class. And I said, of course, don't they realize it's about class? And he said, no, don't they realize that it's a fun movie to watch? And of course, it's a fun movie for our generation might not work in the same way. But if you do remember the film Jaws, there are three main male characters. There's a boat captain, there's a scientist, and there's a police officer. The boat captain, then, Jameson argues, allegorized a certain New Deal, but also Norman Rockwell kind of early 20th century American past, New England Yankee, and so on, real labor as well. The scientist is more aristocratic, more technocratic, and then the police officer, as we know, police officers are virtually the only allowed representation in mass culture for working class masculinity. So we have these three kind of forms of American history. And then he reads The Godfather in two ways, and one of which will be very important for The Wolf of Wall Street. Jameson argues that, first of all, The Godfather was popular in terms of ethnic envy. That is to say, Don Corleone is very much a patriarchal father, the Godfather. And so in post-war American society, there's a feeling that it's only the ethnics, only, say, the Italian Americans, in that sense, who still have a really strong family structure. If you remember the film itself, at the beginning, of course, it's the wedding of his daughter, and he's having these supplicants come to him as though he's some sort of aristocrat or warlord, and he's been asked to intervene into a sexual trauma that one of his client's daughters has gone through. So he very much is that sort of patriarchal father. But Jameson also argues, and this is the first of perhaps many inversions that we will encounter tonight, that what seems to be a gangster film is really about capitalism. That is to say, if you want to look for a system of organized violence and a large corporate structure, this is sort of capitalism, not just the mob itself. And to do this, he partly argues historically. He traces historically how the gangster was featured in American film in the 30s and 40s. He was either a psychotic kind of loner, a la James Cagney, or post-World War II film noir loner. But by the 1970s, with the Corleone family, it's more of an aristocratic and or even sort of faceless corporation, the elite of the mob itself. The other sort of major attempts or workings of film theory that Jameson then indulged in is in a book called The Geopolitical Aesthetic, which came out in 1992. And here Jameson reads conspiracy films, again in the 1970s, in terms of, or at least in the first half of the book, in terms of his methodology of cognitive mapping. He talks about 3 Days of the Condor, All the President's Men, the Parallax View, in terms of, first of all, the non-representability of computer technology. There's a scene, for example, in 3 Days of the Condor where Robert Redford is trying to follow a telephone conversation, and he's in this large bank of telephone switching stations. And Jameson contrasts that with what already he's arguing in 1990, I believe, when he was making this, giving these talks, what was already becoming the 1980s computer technology of just the blob-like computer monitor in gray or beige sort of color, so no longer quite representability. And then he finally also makes an argument for, and again this will be important for talking about the Wolf of Wall Street, for a rivalry between media. He argues that when we have two different media in the same frame, or specifically in a film, that this will inevitably, on the one hand, stage a rivalry between these different media, but also in the end demonstrate the superiority of film. And this he argues specifically in terms of the parallax view. So at one point in that film, Warren Beatty is being indoctrinated to be some kind of an assassin, and they have this slideshow of these different images of American culture. And so the slide images themselves, they're doing some work in terms of the plot, they're sort of this indoctrination, but formally they're also staging a rivalry between different sorts of media. And this works in particular, and actually, so maybe in some ways the trailer was appropriate, because the Wolf of Wall Street itself is rife with different commercials. It begins as a commercial for the stock brokerage that DiCaprio's character has founded, Stratton Oakmont. There's commercials for 1990s shoe manufacturer or shoe house, Steve Madden. There's a commercial for Benihana, the hibachi steakhouse or what have you. I think there's a couple other as well. And so my argument then is that in some ways when these commercials are within the film itself, that there's this kind of rivalry or tension or antagonism between these different sort of media forms, but it's doing a different kind of work than what I want to hold off on with that argument itself and how it sort of plays out. Finally, and this is something that isn't so much in the book that this talk is drawn from, but I've been thinking about more recently, is to think about cognitive mapping on the one hand and paranoia or psychosis on the other. So cognitive mapping is Jameson's term for sort of like a class consciousness or a way of viewing ideology. It comes from the urban geographer Kevin Lynch, who in the 1960s talked about the picture we would have of the world that's around us. So you go out your door in the morning, you go to the coffee shop to the left, or you turn to the right. That's my left, your left. You turn to the right to go catch the bus and so on. This is your map of your neighborhood, of your city. And Jameson uses that idea, calling for a new cognitive map of late capitalism that's all the more difficult to articulate because of the very complexity of these communicational and exchange systems. But what this cognitive mapping is also very similar for, and indeed what Jameson's methodology has been criticized for, especially in this symptomatic versus surface reading or post-theory debates, is a kind of paranoia. It's a very fine line between having a sense of knowing how the world works and being decried as a paranoid. You're just seeing what's not there and so on. And so I'm trying to sort of bring these things together in some kind of way. And there is a way in which, in particular, a book that I make reference to a few times in the study is Canon and Kinko's cartographies of the absolute, where they make a similar argument as well. I'll come back to that later in the talk. Now, most contentious of Jameson's assertions vis-a-vis the utopian is undoubtedly, this fits in somewhat with the themes of this session of Advisor, is the intertwining of utopia and ideology. That is, every cultural object, from advertising to indoor plumbing, will contain or embody a utopian impulse. Now, this much, perhaps, is cultural studies dogma by now. Everyone reads, whether it's in the 80s and the 90s, reading soap operas or action films or more recently social media as some kind of a hegemonic struggle or meaning. But also Jameson argues that the effectively ideological is also necessarily utopian. So bringing the ideological and the utopian together. And of course, ideology is also a matter of practice, not simply a system of ideas. Jameson's text here is by the German Marxist Ernst Bloch, The Principle of Hope, written in the 30s and 40s, published in 1959, where Bloch makes these very, contentious arguments, for example, of a utopian kernel to be found, say, in the KKK. It talks about them as a reactionary distortion of the brigand or the outlaw. And there's this amazing quote I had to end up using from Bloch, where he says, "Every adventure story breaks the moral commandment of pray and work. Instead of the first, cursing prevails. Instead of the second, the pirate ship appears." And we'll see how some of this plays out as well. Especially where Jameson does develop his ideas of utopia. It's all the way through his work, but in his 2006 book, The Archaeologies of the Future. And here Jameson distinguishes between a secular utopia, which is ontological. Every cultural work has a utopian impulse to it because it's in part a gesture to the future. We always live in the future, Locke said. The past only comes later, when we think about the past. So the secular utopia, that is an impulse, or that every cultural object is utopian, versus what we might call the sacred, or that program, the utopian manifesto, utopian novel. And here, Jameson, as well as Zizek, trade quotes like 12-year-olds trade hockey cards. Here, Jameson quotes Freud on the primitive tribe, for whom every dream is sexual, except those that are explicitly so, which is to say that everything is utopian except that which claims to be utopian. So here the problem, on the one hand, is discovering the utopian in a text that is explicitly so, or more likely, perhaps, that it is not. And then, on the other hand, discovering the utopian impulse in what seems to be, on the surface, most unproblematically not utopian, the KKK in Bloch's example, or Nazi Germany. We lived through that as well. Jameson also makes a very clear delineation or connection between utopian space and the enclave. Since Thomas More's literary utopia in the 16th century, which was an island, utopias have always been somewhat removed from society. Jameson's paradigm is the royal court, or priest's salon. And here in the film, you can see, and at one point in the clip, when DiCaprio talks about, Jordan Belfort, his character, talks about how he started his firm in an auto body shop. And even though the film is called The Wolf of Wall Street, he's not on Wall Street, he's not in Lower Manhattan, he's in Long Island. So the idea of Long Island itself as a space, a strong island, as Public Enemy used to call it, but also even this beginning in an auto body shop itself as a kind of an enclave is probably what I'm interested in here. But we also have, in a utopian sense, the problem of work. That is to say, in a utopia, would we need to work? Should we work? Is it possible for anyone to work? Is it possible to have a utopia where nobody has to work? And so in our film, the way in which this sort of problem is articulated is very much through what I call the ideology of work hard and play hard. But certainly is today's ideology par excellence. Is the idea that everybody should yes, of course you should work hard, but then you should do a Tough Mudder competition on the weekend. Or do coke and hang out with hookers, whatever your sort of your desire is itself. So this is to say that those kinds of extreme sports are then the other side of working 18-hour days, making $22 million in 3 hours. So in terms of, this was just a bit of setup in terms of some theoretical concepts coming out of Jameson. But in terms of the film, in terms of Wolf of Wall Street, the first question I want to ask is, how can we talk about class in this film? Now, in an essay on another film, On Dog Day Afternoon, Jameson warns us not to make the mistake of assuming that class can be represented in a substantialist way. That is to say, the film is not so much about its gender politics, the bank robbery to get money for a transgender operation, or even its media politics. And we're very fortunate actually to have Pierre Huyg's Third Memory, which deals in a very rich way with Dog Day Afternoon and the actual history of the event that the film is based on. Third Memory is at the Vancouver Art Gallery right now. But Jameson argues that isn't where the politics is to be found in the film. Rather, the politics is to be found in an analogy of the relationships between Al Pacino's character, a method actor, star, playing a criminal, his relation with a local cop who stands in for the national but is played by a character actor, and then an FBI agent who then stands in for a transnational subject and is a TV actor. So it's a triangulation at three different levels. You have three different actors, the roles they play, and the kind of actors that they are. So the formal, and then the narrative, and then the actual actors themselves. So in terms of taking this kind of formal and analogous and allegorical reading as an inspiration, that's why I'm interested in two moments in the film itself. First of all, how Jordan Belfort, DiCaprio's character, how he assembles his crew, his this part all men who are going to do his selling for him. For the most part, they're these low-level, Long Island wannabe drug dealers, and he assembles his crew in two different ways. First of all, in a restaurant where they're sitting around a table and they're talking and so on, and then back in the workspace itself where he has them sort of stand and deliver, so they're all against a backdrop and he insults them and says various things. So, of course, around the restaurant table, a diner table, a greasy spoon, this is a unique or privileged way in which late 20th century American film sort of spectacularizes masculinity and collective, working class collectivity. Think of films like Diner, or Do the Right Thing, or Reservoir Dogs, but in a gendered space as well. One of Scorsese's first women's pictures called Alice Doesn't Work Here Anymore. There's always this, in these spaces, almost always it's women who are serving the men, so women are in that kind of abject sort of position. So first of all, the crew is assembled in this public space, and then in a word space, which has a sense of, again, with his sprint against the wall, it could be a movie audition, it could be a police interrogation of some sort of thing, all the while with a what's his name? Bard of Long Island, Uptown Girl, Billy Joel, not Uptown Girl, Moving Out, playing over that scene itself. So this is one sort of representation or way to think about class in the film itself. But then at another point, when Belfort is confronted by an FBI agent on his boat, and he makes this argument on his yacht, and he makes this argument that his firm isn't the ones they should be going after. They should be going after the white shoe Wall Street firms such as Goldman, Lehman Brothers, or Merrill, and their collateralized debt obligations. Now, as anyone who has seen The Big Short or followed economic history in the last 5 years knows, CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, and credit debt swaps were how the bundling and tranching or slicing of mortgages in the early 2000s led to the financially subprime mortgage crisis. Besides which, arguably, Belfort's firm and its crimes sort of pale in comparison. So there's two different kind of class arrangements going on. On the one hand, cinematic, the whole assembly of men in a public space, then doubled by Scorsese in the workspace, and then the argument, this notion that his firm is a Long Island firm called a bucket shop or a pump and dump, so very marginal to the large kind of Wall Street firms, that kind of class relationship as well. A third way of thinking about class that I'm interested in as well is the notion of the informer or the snitch as a class traitor. So you think of again, in recent film, Donnie Brasco, Scorsese's own The Departed, Reservoir Dogs, a Hong Kong film by Andy Lau called Internal Affairs, which Scorsese's Departed was based on. They all feature in some kind of way the narrative of either a police informer, so somebody who is working for the police among the criminal world, or the criminal themselves who turn state evidence in a certain kind of way. So this trope, I then argue, is the reason why this trope is so prevalent, or why it holds this kind of narrative attraction for us, is for a number of reasons, and maybe no notions of the psychoanalytic split subject, or the ways in which we're all torn asunder by different demands on our time, but also because in a way it has to do with class loyalty. So quite often in these films, Donnie Brasco is a good example of this. Al Pacino is playing this older gangster, whom Donnie Brasco, who's played by Johnny Depp, yes, thank you. They develop a relationship. And so then the police officer, the snitch, the informer, has to sort of betray that relationship in order for his job to sort of take place. So it allegorizes in a way our sense of class loyalty and class solidarity. Where I go with this then is towards an argument, again, as I was saying at the beginning of my talk, that the film helps us to think about finance capital, and in particular about what I call, a beautiful, elegant phrase, the laborist substantialist thesis, which goes something like this. So there's an early scene where Matthew McConaughey's character schools Belfort, telling him how to make money from their clients, but also saying that we're not making anything. We don't make shit. We don't build anything. It's all fugazi. It's fairy dust. It doesn't exist. It never landed. It's no matter. It's not on the elemental chart. It's not fucking real. So this term fugazi or fugazi, and they play back and forth with the pronunciation, perhaps in kind of a 1970s, 80s New York gangster slang or fake for something that's not true. So this seems to be a proper David Harvey, Neil Smith critique of finance capitalism. They're not really making anything. At one point in America, we made things with blue-collar jobs, and now it's all virtual. It's all not on the elemental chart. It's not fucking real. Again, in terms of contemporary or other kind of cultural objects, Evan Lee's recent exhibition called Fugazi at the Wendy Clark Gallery was these large photographs of zirconium diamonds. So he was playing with that sort of trope as well. Now, I call this the laborist substantialist fallacy because it betrays kind of left nostalgia for blue-collar labor. Nobody liked the factory jobs when they had them, but once they were gone, then we constructed this sort of nostalgia for that moment itself. At that point, they were real jobs, and now we just have the service economy. And obviously, the problem with that reading is that quite often we end up talking about whether it's cultural jobs or information sector or affective labor or feminized jobs. So we get this nostalgia for a certain kind of blue-collar, white, working class masculinity that sort of allows us to ignore what is actually the kind of labor that's going on today. And it also turns out in the film that they do make something. Or rather, it turns out that money is a thing. And this is why you see money taped to a woman's body. This is why the whole narrative trope of how do you launder money? What do you do with money? And people fuck on money. And people snort drugs through money. And people throw money in the garbage. Or they throw it out after the policeman, the FBI agent, when he leaves the boat. So money is this weird thing. On the one hand, that seems to go, that's the thing that they make. They make money. That's an actual object. But even then, I can't even accept the fact that that's actually a thing. It plays a role in the narrative. It stands in for the real. It is fucking real. But even that is only in terms of the plot itself. It's an allegory or an analogy for exploitation. Now, one way in which critics have talked about Martin Scorsese's work is in terms of the ambiguity of his characters. And this is something that perhaps did not end up relevant to the Wolf of Wall Street, but if we go back through the Scorsese canon, say in a film like Mean Streets, we have Charlie, played by Harvey Keitel, who's loyal to his friends. Are we supposed to admire him, but he's also a gangster? Or in Goodfellas, we have Henry Hill, played by Ray Liotta, who's Italian and Irish, so can't quite be in the mob itself. And the big triumphal thing is the fact that he doesn't have to stand in line to get into his restaurant, so he goes in through the kitchen. We're supposed to think this is the great mob life, and so on. But then perhaps even the absence of that ambiguity in a film like The King of Comedy, where you have De Niro playing this stalker fan, Rupert Pupkin, who succeeds in his whole goal of getting onto Jerry Langford's talk show, but then you wonder, did you really, or is it all matters in kind of a postmodern fantasy? That is always in Scorsese. There's a dialectic of expressive realism, Little Italy. He says again and again that he casts Italian Americans because they know the life world that he's trying to convey, versus that kind of expressive realism, versus a kind of role of fantasy, of postmodernism, and even what I would call with the Wolf of Wall Street post-cinema. So the fantasy in films like Kundun or Shutter Island or Hugo. And we see this kind of dialectic then here with the commercials, both real and invented, as I was discussing earlier. And what these commercials in The Wolf of Wall Street do is they stand in for, I argue, the existential threat to cinema of other digital media. That is, the film begins as a commercial, and you're not really sure, because when we watch films now, of course there's usually 10 or 15 minutes of commercials at the beginning at any rate. So the very beginning of the film itself is not clear, so that's a temporal way in which the commercial genre surrounds films themselves. Of course, now quite often, or at least if you're dragged by your 14-year-old to superhero films, you have to wait all the way through the credits at the end to see if there's a blooper reel or an outtake or Iron Man having a falafel or whatever it is. So that the beginning and the end of the films themselves is never quite clear. So these are temporal ways in which these commercial media are surrounding the film, but also it happens spatially. Of course, we often watch films on our laptops or on our tablets, and then we download, and perhaps we're watching with a browser, or this other film is playing all at the same time, especially if perhaps they're pirated, and so on. So my argument then is that the commercials, real and invented in The Wolf of Wall Street, are the stand-in for the threat to cinema itself. We're in a post-cinema moment, volatilization of media in general. Two, we can see in the film various forms of doubling. In the film itself, there's a scene near the beginning where a Ferrari is driving along the highway, and it's either red, and he said, no, my car was, no, it was white, and he said, no, my car was red, like Don Johnson's Ferrari in Miami Vice, and the car suddenly changes. He has two bodyguards named Rocco. Belvoir gives these two speeches where he talks about, he tries to explain how exactly he's making all this money, and then he says, look, you don't care, or you don't know, or I don't care. So he's kind of breaking that kind of address to the audience. We have these two scenes where Belvoir is fucked up on Quaaludes. He tries to drive that same Ferrari, I can't remember which color it is at that point, home. The first time he drives home very slowly. And then we see what actually happened, and he drives it and has an accident that destroys the car. We have these double voiceovers happening in the same order, and finally, the idea of the informant itself as a kind of double. And there are also doubles in the film's interpretations. The symptomatic versus surface reading I was talking about earlier. Cognitive mapping is another layer of meaning. The double informant trope, the utopian hope and envy, and even cinematic repetition. So a utopian reading would be something like this. And this is getting back to the notion of the film ejecting itself. And I was thinking about this in terms of media or residual media. At one point, of course, films were on a brief 20-year period where they were on cassettes, and they would eject themselves when they came to the end of that's a trope I kind of want to do something with. A utopian reading is that in the film's homophobia, so the threat to toss the gay butler out the window, the gay butler then stands in for what Lee Edelman in No Future calls the sent homosexual, or this nihilistic queer subjectivity. In the dwarf tossing, in a scene of shaving a woman's head, in the treatment of women's bodies in general, that this is the film trying to figure out how to represent the collective via the utopian. So it's those very moments in the film is trying to determine who can be in this crew, who can be in this collective, who can be in this collective of these wolves of Wall Street, that this is the utopian kernel itself. I'll just give two kind of exercises on this. The first is, there's a scene in the film where it's general mayhem in the office. You have weekly debauching sort of parties, the naked marching band coming through, for example, which in an odd way, I just rewatched Citizen Kane. And there's a marching band coming into a meeting for Citizen Kane too. I think it's when Kane comes back after traveling abroad or something. So, and of course the cinematic aspect, or the way in which Citizen Kane stages the newsreels and so on. But so there's this one scene where a female broker has agreed to have her head shaved for $10,000. And it pretty much looks as though the actress actually is having her head shaved at that moment. I'm not an expert on how you would fake that, so perhaps it's not, but it does seem to be a real act of humiliation. And but then there's also this argument that Ernst Bloch makes when he's talking about scapegoating and public acts of anti-Semitism in the 1930s in Germany, of Jews having their pants cut off at the knee or women having their heads shaved, which of course then happened after World War II with collaborators. So there's this weird way in which this humiliation itself is this attempt on the part of the film to figure the blockages of its own ideology. That would be the utopian argument. And I was also thinking, of course, Dan alluded to this at the beginning of the Fred Moten event here in the fall, and then the artist run center itself as an enclave, and what that utopian enclave and the limits of what that utopian enclave can be, and why we have to think about those limits. Okay, so some final things, and then maybe a Q&A. So I did have this thing about Yeezus, the Kanye West, as a way to think about what cannot be in the film. So this kind of black skinhead. So this is the song, very much contemporary 2010s kind of aggressive hip hop, but African Americans play almost no role in the film at all. And it's symptomatic then that the music is used to market the film, but the music that is not in the film. The music is always for Scorsese, is always of the moment of the film taking place and one that takes place in the 90s. But I did want to play the trailer, in part because Jameson argues in his essay Culture and Finance Capital from 1997 on the film trailer as an autonomous work of art itself. He references Giovanni Arrighi's The Long 20th Century, and he argues that the film trailer is now fully autonomous, like finance capitalism. And indeed, he has a whole discussion of derivatives, and he gave some version of that when he was here in 2010 as well. So the absence of Kanye from the film, and absence from the video, which is a bit more unfortunate, then signifies or symptomatizes its non-dit, its en pensée, what cannot be said in the film itself. But also in that question of the laborist substantialist fallacy. So now I'll ask we can explicate the Gramscian semiotic rectangle that's up here, which people know I love talking about in general as a form. So, saying that in the film itself we have these two ideologies of finance and violence, and then we stage their opposites, so the non-violent and no money. And Wolf, he tells his brokers to be telephone terrorists, he tells them to use their telephones like the AK-47. So he's in that position as both of finance and violence, standing for capitalism in general. Now the gangster then, who stands in for the working class, is violent, but has no money. The brokers, then, they have money, but they're non-violent. There's the only violence you see them do at one point, they're taking a baseball bat and hitting the floor. I mean, it's not absolutely accurate, but theory doesn't have to be. And then, this is my leftist plea for the brocialist. So the brocialist is the left today. Caught in this identity politics moment, the brocialist, of course, is the term post-Occupy, used to attack the left for being exclusive, for being overly white and male. But the brocialist is not willing to be violent and has no money. We're not willing to use violence. That's why we're at the bottom of the rectangle. We could have turned it around and had it top, but still, we don't need top. So leftist plea for the brocialist. So the film posits the alliance of finance, capital, and violence, via the flipping. So it's kind of back and forth. In Jameson, in his essay on the Godfather, says what seems to be a gangster movie is really a film about capitalism. And not that I'm saying this is a film about, seems to be a film about capitalism, but really it's a gangster film. But rather, it's an incessant flipping of the two. Not saying they're both the same thing, but the representations themselves. So the film is positing this alliance of finance capital and violence. Gangsters, like workers, have no capital, can be violent. Brokers do not require violence, but have capital. The brocialist, the Marxist, trapped in an identity politics president, is now their violent Marxist access to capital. A final comment, and this is from thinking about Toscano and Kinko's cartographies of the absolute, where they very much work out Jameson's cognitive mapping in terms of global representations of capitalism. It's a bit, and there was a very interesting discussion that Toscano took part in E-Flux in 2015, edited by David Hodge and Hamid Yousefi, about representation, about cognitive mapping and paranoia, and questions of how to represent finance, which falls a bit into another elegant phrase of mine, the in-flight magazine aesthetic. You know, those paintings that look like the maps of where an airline flies. You know, they try and represent capital flows and so on, and they all kind of look, they have lines and dots and colors. But it's a way to try to think about this. Although Toscano, I think, do warn and repeat Jameson's very argument that cognitive mapping should not be thought of as simply a matter of cartography, simply a matter of maps themselves, but then they actually have a map on the cover of the book. So, fast and loose there. But very interesting in terms of how they go from I root for Rocky to the film The Other Guys. I don't know if anyone's seen The Other Guys, Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg, I believe, which the film itself, it's okay, but it ends with this very, kind of like an IMF PowerPoint on the whole post-2008 economic meltdown, compares how much bankers are getting paid out, in the millions, to what the pension for an NYPD cop is. Again, the police officer is the only allowed representation of working class masculinity, the police officer. But they make up some very interesting arguments along those lines. Or also, for a final local cultural object of representation, I had actors play Invisible Hand on right now by the Pie Theatre at the Couch, deals in some ways with some of these questions as well. And now maybe I'll take your questions. Thank you. Trevor.
Clint, I'll get things going. A couple of vignettes to the question. Jamesonian vignettes. As you know, Fredric and I spent a very bizarre week in Kyushu, in Japan, just as the bubble burst in 1992, with Jacques Derrida and Renko Vason, and which was strange.
What year?
1992. Just when the Japanese real estate bubble burst. So we spent a week talking about cities and architecture and theory then. Then I hadn't seen him until just one time you got him, 2010 maybe. And we had a little bit of time to look at the city, or around the city, and talk about this very strange thing. Where a lot of the urban narratives of other places apply less, well, don't apply, but apply less. I mean, the old narratives of field to factory to finance don't really apply here. We've got a master narrative of real estate from day one, and really only one industry ever. So
CPR to today.
And we become a society of real estate developers, dam builders, and bridge builders. In all these cases, you take a public good, capital, and you privatize it. So we're a different creature than Wall Street. So this is now my question to you. Okay, if the wolf of Wall Street doesn't apply to this city, what movie might? Or if that's too hard a question, what animal would stand for the wolf?
The beaver. International animal that bites off its nuts. That's a brocialist. have beers but no nuts. A film.
What do you think about that? I'll give you an animal. How good is pine beetle? You know, with global warming, global change, things go where they don't go before. Pine beetles eat their hosts and destroy them. So it's kind of city is consumed by real estate, which is this one, they invest in its worst thing.
Isn't the SFU Surrey campus, isn't the exposed wood used in that architecture? Isn't they call it denim wood now? Is that how they gentrified it, right? Yeah, so I think it can be used for it. But it's, I wonder if it's more decorative than like marble cladding. Sorry, I can't think of the film right now. Hardcore Henry. It's all GoPro. Vancouver is a GoPro. The GoPro aesthetic. I'm just going to wait. They told me I have to stay till 9. Although I didn't know I wasn't getting paid. Yeah.
What do you think the role for a brocialist is in terms of social justice? I mean, if a brocialist is a, decently well-off male person who's making a lot, I mean, what about other people who are disenfranchised, or don't have money to put food on the table? But, I mean, what is the brocialist role?
Throw bombs. I mean, two answers. One is, I mean, if specifically what I try to do in my work is try to think about how do we understand how can I use what my training is as somebody who talks about culture to figure out what's happening in the world. Is it going to understand what the world is? I mean, I think, and that's Jameson's argument too, that we don't know what capitalism is. I think that's because of fundamental changes that have happened and continue to happen in terms of what capitalism itself is. It's not known. And I can't speak to what activism should be. That's not what I do, and I would be presumptuous of me to make that kind of claim. But I mean, if that my argument is that the brocialist as a subject, right, is there because there's someone who, on the one hand, they don't have access to the means of production. They don't have or reproduction or financialization, therefore they don't have the money. But they also don't have access to capital. But also the left today is not willing to turn to those kinds of violence.
Do you think you have to know what capitalism is to, I mean, you understand our economy and our system through your own lived experience of it?
No, I don't think one does.
No, I'm just saying, do you need to in order to
figure out how to change it? Yeah. I do think we have to understand it. I'm not saying you have to understand it through watching films. I'm not saying that. There's other forms of understanding from lived experience and so on, but one does have to understand it. One does have to know how do you change the state? How do you
I mean as a definition. So like as in like a sort of a cohesive definition versus the experience of a system, or the way that I understand the word table means without having to define that has 4 legs, because it might have 3, but I understand from its relation to other objects.
I don't know what capitalism is, but I know it when I see it.
Kind of.
Yeah. I don't think we know it when we see it. I don't think we know it when we see it. That's the whole question. Partly because of the way, I mean, the ways in which, on the one hand, the ideology is so powerful. The ideologies now of digital connectivity, that people can make this kind of money wherever you are, that these things are available to us. Those ideologies are I think are very powerful. But they're always being worked out and troubled and figured out in narratives. And so, back in the 90s, when I used to go to this group called the Martin Scorsese group, the argument would be if a film made $50 million in the first week, then we had to go see it because that meant it was popular. That meant it was, in some ways, it was doing what what Levi Strauss called an imaginary resolution to a real contradiction. It was figuring out something for us. That popular culture figures out things for us, and popular culture does it in the realm of the popular. And it tells us what we're trying to think. And I think in some ways what Wolf of Wall Street does is it tries to figure, okay, here's this Scorsese working with his bag of tricks. All right, now we have this guy who made, based on a true story, who made all his money operating at the margins. So he's that kind of underdog, the fantasy, the American fantasy of the outsider. In the same way that someone like Henry Hill is an outsider to the mob, he's an outsider to Wall Street. That's a very attractive figure for American ideology in general. For Scorsese as someone who produces that kind of ideology. But just through the narratives that he made, that he puts together, they end up saying things that, and that's just the art of symptomatic reading, said they end up saying things that it's not his intention, it's not his control. How can he control the meaning of a film? It involves hundreds of people. It involves millions of dollars of production and so on. I'm not making the old tourist argument that Scorsese film he has control over every shot and so on. And he is fanatical in that sort of way. But even an anecdote that Thelma Schumacher, his editor, talks about when they're actually in the editing room, they have another movie playing. And Turner's Classics, they're stuck in this thing in the 50s, right? And so how is that getting into the film? What's that doing? Yeah, Richard.
The film is structured as a loop. So at the very end, after he's done his 3 years in prison, we see Jordan in Auckland, New Zealand, repeating a scene that occurred toward the very, very beginning of the movie, namely him holding out a pen and say, "Sell me this pen." Now, at the beginning of the movie, someone figures it out. Supply and demand is the answer.
Write your name down. Yeah.
At the end, we go through 3 people, none of them figures it out, and that's the end of the movie.
Okay, well, a couple of things. First of all, in terms of plot. And there's that new book by Carolyn Richard on the Victorians, which, and like every other book, she has a chapter on The Wire. But these guys do, James does. I need to read another rest of The Wire ever. But in terms of plot, so the plot of The Wolf of Wall Street is, it begins in media res, in a certain kind of way. He's telling you he has all these houses, boat, beautiful wife, and he does all these drugs and hookers and so on. The FBI is investigating. So you get the pinnacle, as it were, of what he's doing. And then you go back to him starting out, and we have that scene. That's when he's assembling his crew, and this one guy, Brad, who is inside and outside. He's again another ethnic character. He always has the Hebrew chai letter, and the naked sort of chest sort of scene. He's the one who says, "Sell me this pen." The other guy doesn't know what to do, and he says, "Write down your name. I need a pen." Supply and demand. So that happens at that point, and then we get the captain, Belfort, is getting more and more caught up in the police investigations. And he's arrested, and he gets out, he's arrested, gets out. So the plot in some ways is up and down, as opposed to just going from good and getting better and then getting punished at the end, which is what happens in something like Goodfellas. But the fact that at the end he's now a motivational speaker, and if you type in Jordan Belfort, like almost any well-known person's name on Google, now it always asks, one of the things it'll say is, "What is his net worth?" You notice that? You type in somebody famous now, that one of the things they ask, I know Richard Cabell, type in Richard Cabell, they say, "What is Richard Cabell's net worth?" Your question was, what do you do with that? Well, I think that, he, like the banks, he's too big to fail. He can't just be punished because of his appetites, which is the conservative way in which a film like Goodfellas ends. Because he went, Ray Liotta's character went against what his boss wanted to do, what Paulie wanted to do. He started getting drugs. And then, he stole from his own supply, so he get into hopped up on coke and so on. And then he ends up, in the Midwest somewhere with no good pasta around anymore, right? It's just like ketchup. So he's punished for his appetites, whereas as Belfort, the character, and maybe because Scorsese felt he had to be true to the financial life of Balfour, because the actual Balfour is still making millions every year, mostly from his speaking tours. So there's that.
Thank you.
But did you think about, what about my reading of the Gay Butler scene? Don't you think like that? I mean, they confront Jonah Hill's character, and he's already, I mean, it's very much a Tea Party kind of idea, because we already know that he's married to his cousin. So that's the open door, right? If you allow gay marriage, people are going to marry their cousins. But so he's already like that, and then it turns out, I like to get fucked up and go dancing. What's wrong with that? You know? And so there's a way in which this is the film ejecting itself. That's not the content of what is being ejected. It's the fact that it has to eject something. And that character who knows how to sell a pen, he ends up dying the same age as Mozart.
So what do we conclude with the fact that Jonah Hill's character, if we read him as queer, is supposed to be his image?
Whose character?
Jonah Hill's character.
Oh, yeah. But he's also, I don't know if anyone's read Lee Edelman's book, No Future, which Peter told me about years ago, and I finally did read it this year. But part of his argument there is about that children are this ideology of the permanence of capitalism. And again, when Balfour finds out that this guy is married his cousin, he's like, aren't you worried about the kids? Blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, if that happened, I would just, drive out to the country and say, go away, be free, be free. So, so it's played in a weird way. It's played as this totally nihilistic, bizarre character. And it's partly one of the failings of the film that more was done with that. But in terms of, the informant, there's a lot. I think there's a lot there about the idea of the informant and class solidarity and class betrayal. Because Balfour's character keeps trying not to do that. At one point, he's wearing a wire, but he writes on a post-it note when they're having sushi, I'm wearing a wire. And so it's figuring at that point that there's a reason or that there's a motivation not to be like that. But then if I didn't realize that he was a snitch as well. They all are at a certain point, right? They would all tell anyone anything.
I don't know, maybe I misread that scene. Yeah. That's what I assumed he gave the napkin to the
Oh, that's good. I've seen that film so many times. Yes, Peter watched it once. Are you going to blog about this? No. Yeah, Alex.
So it's not really a question, it's more of a statement, unfortunately. And like the case being that I haven't seen The Wolf of Wall Street and I haven't read your book, and I'm piecing these two things together as one.
I should have said it. I don't know why at the beginning. Yeah, this is from a book coming out in the fall.
Yeah, right, there you go. But it seems like one of the things that you're working through in this talk and probably in the book too is like charting different moments from Jameson and like a particular tradition of criticism. Is like thinking about questions to do with representing class, representing capitalism. And then we started to have this conversation about cognitive mapping, what it is, and I guess I almost just want to echo the line that you figured is like a particular kind of critique that the film isn't accurate enough, kind of as part of that conversation.
Oh my Agatha Christie trope at the beginning?
Yeah, well, like needing to understand, like, do we need to understand capitalism? How much do we need to understand capitalism? And then in this case, we don't get Layman, we don't get Goldman. This is not a film about them. This is like a film about, as you put it, like an outsider. So then, like, how, like, what's going on in that gap between this and Layman? Or like, do we not need that film, or does this film somehow tell us something in spite of the fact that it's not?
Was Margin Call the one that was the Jeremy Irons plays a Goldman Sachs kind of higher up? Scanner and Kinkle again. They I'll be turning the book to the library and you can take it out. But they have an entire chapter called Filming the Crisis, where they talk about a number of different ways in which films, going back to the 30s, but leading up to talking about the early 2000s, the mid 2000s crisis. The three different things. One is that when Jameson is talking about in terms of class, and he's talking about Dog Day Afternoon, he says it's not in those places where the politics is. It's not in the mediatized way in which this bank robbery became a live television sort of event, as it were. It's not in terms of the bank robber Sonny coming out and having the film as well. He starts chanting Attica, 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 and there's just been these riots in the New York State prison in Attica. It's not about the gender politics that Sonny is doing this to get money for his partner to have a transsexual operation, a sex change operation, which again, Pierre Weed's exhibition goes into in quite amazing detail. It's quite wonderful. But he uses spatial things to talk about the edge of the film. It's on the margins, and so he's doing that kind of deconstructive reading in a way by talking about it in that kind of way. And then similarly, I think what is going on in the local Wall Street, we're not getting the center of Wall Street here. We're getting a spatial edge. We're getting Long Island. We're getting, he starts out after he gets fired after Black Monday in 1987, and Belford ends up at this bucket shop, and it's in a strip plaza. You hear a toilet flush when he walks in there. And they have the ads for the place are in the back of Hustler magazine and Popular Mechanics. So it's very much the blue collar, if you will, kind of stock brokerage. And they say and Belford said, I'm selling garbage to garbage men. So it's his wife who said, well, why not sell to rich people instead? So it is at the margins in a way, and maybe, and I think partly this is, for better or for worse, a tendency in this kind of criticism is that the layman is not a thing. The mistake is to say if we can actually, if we're in the room, we're having that conversation, if we can actually capture it, there's a documentary realism, then we would know how capitalism works, and then we can figure out how to change it. But that's a fallacy. That's similar to the laborist substantialist fallacy or ideology of what work really is. Work is really making things. Johnny, you make these, right? Yeah. We're in art gallery. These things are not made in factories anymore. Factories don't do this, right? They're making things in that kind of way. Of course, things are still made. There are still things. I'm not saying, but the mistake is that labor and exploitation involves things. It does not involve things. It's more different. It's not that. It's not that. It's my argument. And I think it's the argument that Jameson's theory leads us to. In the same way, he's saying you don't represent, if you want to look for class, it's not in the representation of the worker. It's in that relationship between those different kind of acting styles and roles they play in the narrative and the actors themselves. So Pacino is a big deal guy, but also a method actor, always ranting, raving, and sweating and all this kind of thing. And the other actors have their different kind of styles as well. So it's about the form, it's about cinema, it's about how acting takes place, it's about the narrative, but it's not about the idea that a proper political film is going to heroically show, a worker making things. That's exactly what he's arguing against. And so in the same way, a proper Marxist film or political film about, I'm not saying that's what this is, but about finance capitalism. And again, this Canon and Kinkler, they go through a lot of different possibilities there, but they're really critical, say Isaac Julian and so on. So it's not only pop culture that they're holding up to the mirror. That a cultural attempt to interrogate, what a thinking metaphor that is, right? To think about what capitalism itself is. I mean, I don't know. What would a Jamesonian reading of Peter Sterrell's Liquidity be? The first thing I think is every time I walk into the Vancouver Art Gallery, there's all these people sitting there on this nice blue mechanism thing and seeing the show. But they're all sitting there. My kid was watching for like 20 minutes. I think it's partly because he was tired, and I think that's partly, it's very smart. If you want to have people watch your video, it has some nice comfy chairs on it. It's not that Boris Groys moment anymore. I remember his essay from the 90s where he's pretty critical of being comfortable when you watch videos. But Peter Sterrell is not about that. So, but at any rate, there's something in what she's trying to do. Maybe that's.
I haven't seen the movie either, but I was wondering that what you're saying, isn't the movie actually showing capitalism precisely through this displacement into the margin? Because that is the not
Is the movie showing?
Precisely capitalism through its displacement into the margins, because capitalism is not the worst trait. It is the not known, and all of these different knowns that are diffused and act in certain ways. The sort of belief that there is the other capitalism, that is perhaps also the fallacy of activism, the bigger other things. Something concrete.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe the film is working through the political unconscious of finance capitalism via the narrative's need to exclude certain bodies. The narrative need, there's a weird way in which money, the object money, I use the phrase the money shot way too often. But there are money that's being shot. And there's pictures of money, and especially the money shot, arguably, for late 20th century film, is money in a counting machine, which I first remember seeing in Scarface, in Brian De Palma's Scarface. There's a money counting machine scene in here as well. And so it's a thing, that's not capitalism, but I'm trying to get to your to answer your question.
See that in more streets.
Hmm?
And you would not see that. You don't see that.
No, the money's not there. No, of course not. It's electronic or what have you. And even then, so in the 1987 scene, they are still the brokerage firm that is in is still using pneumatic tubes to deliver callers from one part of the building to another. Just like that, didn't you do that in Paris? Also, the pneumatic tube, you put a ledger into it. So that's even more antiquarian in a way.
May I just say something very close to that field? UBC from prior to the hospital, they use a rabbit to
They still do.
goes under the playing field.
Good to know.
That's the money shot.
yeah, I just put shot rats. But so if when the guy is telling when Matthew McConaughey's character is telling Belfort, we don't make anything, it's Fugazi, Fugazi, it's Mahazi, Waluzi, whatever. When he's saying that seems to be, as I'm Jeff Durkin's off the continent, so I can slag Neil Smith and David Hartman perhaps. But it seems to be making that kind of second international argument that we're not making real things anymore, and even in The Wire they have that. People used to make shit, now we just have their hands in each other's pockets. And so there was a golden moment of ethically proper capitalism, and now it's just financialization. But then that financialization turns out to be money, and then money turns out to be a thing. And so many of these films, it's about bags of money, it's about what you do with the money, it's about laundering money, all those sorts of things. But then that isn't the thing either. That's just a thing, but it's not the thing. Because, Alessandra, there is not a thing. That's the thing. It is not an actual object that is capitalism. Whether that means it's about relations, is it exploitation? Exploitation is capitalism. That's the whole problem, isn't it? But it's exploitation. That's why we're against it. That is exploitation. I don't care about the earth. That's stupid for you to say that. But exploitation is what I care about. That's what matters. And that's what's wrong. And this film, I think, is figuring that via the ways in which the drug, sex, money vortex become stand in for each other. The money's taped to the woman's body. They fuck with money. He rolls up, he's snorting coke, this is the best drug ever. It's not that, the coke, it's the money. But then he throws that $100 bill into the garbage because it's dirty now, and it's rough, So there's a kind of way in which if a gangster film is really a capitalist film, which is really a gangster film, the money is really sex, which is really drugs, which is really money. And maybe that interchangeability in some ways is a feature of capitalism, is the motor by which that exploitation takes place.
When you mentioned
Yeah.
What is your position on this claim that even the most unlikely cultural products contain utopic impulses? It seems to me like he transposes onto the secular sphere a very Judeo-Christian promise of a sweet hereafter, and in both cases, the kind of Marxist promise of future reward, utopia, and the Christian notion of paradise, or kind of mystification as a distraction from the urgency of the here and now, and both are expressions of a very Western kind of linear conception of history that is perhaps limited.
I wouldn't accept that it's linear. I had a discussion with Rebecca Schneider about this last week, about whether Benjamin's notion of history is linear or not. I don't think that it is. The Western or not, I can't speak to whether what the other sort of possibilities are. But I mean, when he's saying we live in the future and the past is still to come, that doesn't sound linear to me. That sounds much more. I mean, Jameson's term is disruptive futurism, futurity, which disruptive now is a Silicon Valley meme, so it's kind of icky. But in the sense that it's not about the future in the sense of, what planet will my grandchildren have? That notion of future. It's not that kind of futurity. And I don't think Judeo-Christian is Frank's. I think it's, with all respect, I think it's a lazy criticism to call something, say that the problem is Judeo-Christian. Because that's a huge, it's like saying Western, this is huge things within that, the radical traditions, and he writes on Thomas Manzer and so on, the idea of peasant rebellions, and I think to then dismiss it as that, I'm not, maybe you are, I don't know if you are, but it doesn't, for me it doesn't get me anywhere.
I just think we have, some master troops and master metaphors that kind of structure the way we look at things, and Utopia is one of them. And I think it is very, very rooted in a Christian worldview. That's not to say that I prefer, Adorno's idea of utopias. Utopia can only really be expressed through negativity and fragmentation and disaster. Then Ernst Lux seems kind of naive and dated. I mean, he was a very, he settled in East Germany, and he was politically committed to, Eastern Soviet-style capitalism and a promise of workers' utopia.
Yeah.
So I just wonder, what is your position on, do you think, what is the utopic moment in this film?
It's in setting up this, marginal finance capitalist sort of outfit taking on Wall Street. It's this narrative of going against the white shoe firms. These large, when he sets it up, and he tells us there's two very interesting things that when Belfort is setting up, he has the auto body shop and he gets this new logo, Stratton Oakmont, as old as the fucking Mayflower, right? So that's one. That's American anxiety about there's no aristocracy, it doesn't go that far enough. So colonial anxiety, obviously. But the second thing is he says, you're Captain Ahab, and he has a script that he's written, and the script I talk as well about the mediatization that's going on. But it's a script for the telephone sales, and it says, and this is how you're going to hook the whale, and right, and someone says, Captain who? And of course, and they're going the book, and then of course nobody's read Moby Dick, but it's that American narrative that's being mobilized there, and in very telling ways, I think, because it's this narrative of anxiety about longevity, how old America is, anxiety. Plus, you can read the Moby Dick scene in terms of, is that just another American expansionist, resource extraction narrative? Or, I don't think that's what Bill is doing. But the narrative that's there, is going after something, can that be read in a radical way in terms of what they're going after? And the 1%, you're going to hook the 1%. This isn't it, you know, my stupid research. This is Tim Belfer's biography published in, I don't know, 03 or something. It's a pre-Occupy kind of meme that he's using. That Belfer was already using. We were going to hook the 1%. So, and of course it's capitalist. I'm not denying that kind of stuff, but I'm saying that in terms of the narrative, that notion of going after the rich to make money, and going after Wall Street, the hegemony of Wall Street, via the narrative trope of the gangster film, of the crime narrative, of the heist picture, is utopian work. The work that no one's doing. Yeah.
I'm just curious, I didn't really understand the ejection, the homosexuality scene.
Two things. If James's argument, the idea of political unconscious, is that there's this non-D, this non-pensé, something not said, it cannot be acknowledged by a narrative. And that seems to be a very modernist ideology, because now, of course, we have a narrative. Where would you find the unsaid in the Jackass film? Right? They'll say anything, you know. So how does it work in terms of that? But in terms of this film here, so we have a scene where this gay butler is threatened, is beat up, is held over the edge of the balcony of his apartment because of this orgy, but maybe he stole some money, and so on. But even when they're confronting him, he points out, Jonah Hill's character, you know, I saw you at this club, at the Lollipop Club. So that reminds us, oh, it's Jonah Hill, maybe does that mean he's gay as well? It's not really followed up in any kind of way, because in part the scene is virulently homophobic in terms of the language itself that's used. But then this ejecting, this attempt to get rid of that character. So our first reading is, yes, of course it's homophobic, and that is true, it is homophobic, and the way in which those scenes play out at different times indulges in those kinds of that kind of language. But then because we have this notion of a character who's already within the compact, the bros, the crew of Belfort's sort of scenario, what does it mean that they're ejecting somebody out of it who has betrayed in a way? So two things. One is it's formal. The idea of ejection is a notion of the film's unconscious. The film's unconscious then is not, or political unconscious, is not only that it's heteronormative, but that heteronormativity is also queer. There's a queerness in that heteronormativity. Whether that means something like homosocial, I don't know, because it's much more about that, you know. And that's what films for the last 10 years. You always have those films where, you know, two naked straight guys are too close to each other in the shower or whatever. You know, don't stand too close to a naked man. Wasn't that the home improvement guys book, right? So like that's the post, you know, queer nation ideology, fetishistic disavowal. I know very well I'm homophobic, but I'll acknowledge it, and somehow that allows me to get away with it. You know, did I say a homophobic thing? I didn't mean that. I respect however you are. Those kinds of lines in the film as well. Yeah.
I've been waiting during your talk for that moment where you addressed the friend who kept here. I didn't practice the week.
I wasn't at that.
Said that you
I wasn't at that. We talked about the word.
Yeah. And then the moment arrived, you were going to say something about it, and I don't know what happened to my brain. Shut up. And I want you to maybe return to that just for a second.
Artist-run culture as a utopian enclave. And I can't speak to what happened that night in terms of people. There are some people in the room I know who were there, and if anyone wants to speak to that, I invite them to. But I think the space, and I've been in and around artist-run culture in Vancouver since the mid-90s, and especially in the downtown core, and what public spaces are, and what happens in those public spaces. And I remember, man, when the Orbits were on Hastings, and there were so many people who would not go there, and because of the street violence, real and or perceived. Of course, it was real. I mean, know with Picton and so on, the kind of violence that was happening in the streets of Vancouver, but not right from the or necessarily. But then also as a nod to what I think is the importance of artisan culture and its spaces, to my mind, to spaces that allow this kind of thinking to take place. I mean, a friend of mine who's on the board of Art Speak was talking about that they're going through a hiring right now, and this person was asking me what I thought, no, they should hire, because it wasn't that. It was like, what do you think of? And I said, well, Woodland School here, Vancouver Art and Economy, Art Speak put together, the Vancouver Anthology that I think was an art gallery thing originally, right? You know? So these public events where people are thinking out loud. I mean, of course, I'm a critic. I like that kind of stuff. I mean, as well as all the other kind of cultural production that takes place in these places. We get the Oregon on these tastings that Am and I set up, and other people set up in 1921, that outreach program back in '98. And there was a giant PVC tube going across the space with water trickling down it. While we were having this sort of outreach program for barrier-free education. So that these spaces can be a space for that also means that other shit is going to happen. And that's the question of the ejection. And I've been in spaces, I've actually walked people out. And I've been called a gentrifier because I walked people out because they were being violent. It was when I was doing Humanities 101, so someone I had a relationship with, and the guy was shit-faced. And he was with, oddly enough, when the Marx in Soho play was playing at the Heritage Hall back in like 2000 or 99 or something like this. And this guy kept standing up and saying, no, you're all wrong, blah, blah, blah. And so I did that, and I was a virtual brocialist.
You mentioned how the boundaries of films are becoming more indistinct in this case, and how the commercial and the film are bleeding into one another. And one of the things that I noticed when I was watching the movie is I enjoyed it up to a point, and then it just wouldn't end. It was just one scene of snorting cocaine on hookers after another. And it struck me that it had a very particular structure, and it was playing with the fact that it just wouldn't end.
You stopped watching after about 5 minutes.
Because it's the same scene over and over again for the majority of the film. Right. So I'm wondering if you had anything to say about the film structure and sort of repetitive structure.
The first thing is that, the idea of the volatilization of the media object, this is one, again, it's a very well-known narrative of what was an avant-garde practice in the 60s, is now firmly a capitalist practice. The object no longer has to exist. You just download something, Lisa the Card is rolling around in her world. She was. Who came up with the idea of the dematerialization of the art object and a radical anti-capitalist tendency and conceptualism in the 1960s. In terms of its never ending. Who watches a movie all at once anyway? Maybe it's a rookie mistake, or you're doing it this afternoon because you're coming to talk tonight. But it's weird because they're always unending now. They always keep going. Binge watching, right? Is that we have this kind of appetite, it seems, or some people, enough people have an appetite for watching hours and hours and hours of the same characters doing the same things. That's great. Yeah, that's another way to think about this. The film itself is its own binge watch. So that's a good thing, right, Mark?
Or just a string of meme. It's like a meme that's just reiterated in different.
I talked about that in terms of repetition for sure. I have a whole thing about doubling at the conclusion. People get aggressive, but I have a whole thing about doubling. This is going on and on too, right? about doubling in the film and how these scenes that get repeated. So when he has these two scenes where he's assembling his crew, the first time in the dining room, the second time back in the workspace, it's as though Scorsese were, offering within the film alternative takes. So now, of course, we're used to in the past 10 or 15 years, there's director cuts on DVD, and you watch the Seinfeld documentary, and then there's outtakes at the end, and you watch them too because it's still early, and then that night you can't remember what was in the film, what wasn't. So that blurring of the boundary of what the art object, the cultural object is, which is already going on because of viewing practices, and because of how those objects themselves were packaged for, after the first time that they were released, for DVD release, and so on. So that in some ways gets folded back, an inoculation in a way. But there's also at the Artists and Institutions conference at SFU Woodward's, Lauren Brown and a few other people in this room were involved in back in 2012. So Jonathan was there. There were these people doing this pirate project, and they were talking about book piracy in Colombia or Venezuela, where books would be pirated and they would add chapters. And it was like just one of those kind of surreal things, and so the art, the cultural object itself, I think, is already, its boundaries are permeated. But that isn't necessarily, at one point we thought that was a radical thing, to transgress boundaries. No, it's just business as usual. Just another thing for movie to do or anything else.
Final questions, comments?
I have one maybe sort of half-formed question, which is about methodology, maybe, or something like that. And because you brought up at the beginning this thing about paranoia and interpretation, and that's something that I've thought about a little bit recently too. And I'm curious to know, and then later on though, when the question of like sort of another kind of like another layer being the kind of another potential kind of origin or impulse behind it being about Judeo-Christian or Western impulse that you're like, no, that's too far. So where do you too far, like as in kind of like maybe it's just too general, but it's not about kind of digging kind of below, yet another layer and another layer. Where do you determine where to stop then? And maybe that's just maybe you could just speak about that dynamic between paranoia and impulse that you want to obviously hold on to kind of find something underneath, and about where you stop.
Well, two short, specific answers. One is, Jameson lays out these three hermeneutic levels, the text, and then it's sort of as a class, in terms of class struggle, and finally in terms of history of modes of production, from ancient pre-capitalist formations to some unimaginable future communist socialist utopia. So that's where he stops, going all the way from 5,000 before the Common Era to whatever the sort of future is. But I don't think there is a stopping. I think that's why I wanted to reclaim paranoia and psychosis as a political method or interpretive strategy. And to say that when they say we're being paranoid, this is what the anti-theory, the anti-symptomatic reading people do in the 2009 differences issue, in Bordwell and Carroll's post-theory collection of essays. When they say we're paranoid, be paranoid. There are these other sorts of interpretations. There are these other conspiracies and so on. And the conspiracy figure, why is it that the conspiracy figure is such the two subjectivities that really seem to be fair game. One is somebody who doesn't work. So what did I see at the movie the other night, the ad for Kodo, whatever that phone company, Kodo, right? And it says, this guy walks in, somebody's playing video games, and says, some carriers service is like your brother who dropped out of art school. Sometimes they work, sometimes the figure of somebody who doesn't work. That's way worse than a pedophile, than a terrorist, somebody who doesn't work. But the other figure is the tin person with the aluminum hat. The paranoid guy, right? The one who's worried about your feelings. I was at a water event and yelled at somebody started talking about fluoridation. So that's the other sort of figure of a total outsider that can't be admitted to in kind of civil society who doesn't work, art students in general, right? And somebody who thinks there's things to do. Let's embrace the lazy, the right to be lazy, Paul Bar, 1889 something. Let's embrace the paranoid conspiracy theory guy, girl, person. But I'll stop. Thank you, everyone.